The winter air in the American Midwest carried with it a biting chill, sharp enough to sting the faces of men accustomed to the damp forests and ruined cities of Europe. Behind barbed wire fences, rows of German prisoners of war shuffled forward, their breath rising in small white clouds. They had marched under banners of conquest, once proud soldiers of the Reich, and now they stood weary and subdued, reduced to numbers in a foreign land. Hunger gnawed at them, not in the form of empty stomachs, because here they were fed, but in a different way, a deeper hunger for familiarity, for the foods and comforts of home that had been stripped away by war. It was then, on an otherwise unremarkable day, that something extraordinary unfolded. Into their hands were placed rations unlike anything they had ever seen before. A small, foil-wrapped bar with a name that meant nothing to them. Hershey's, and a jar of a strange, thick paste, the color of roasted earth. At first, they stared in silence, suspicious and uncertain. Propaganda had long warned them of America's corruption, its excesses, and its grotesque indulgences. Surely this could not be real food. The first hesitant taste broke that silence. A sweetness so pure, so indulgent, melted across their tongues, unlike the rationed bread and ersatz coffee of their homeland. It was followed by the creamy, salty richness of peanut butter, clinging to the mouth, alien yet irresistible. Hardened men who had endured artillery fire and the collapse of cities found themselves overwhelmed. Some laughed nervously, others whispered in disbelief, and a few, unable to contain the swell of emotion, began to cry. What force could reduce battle-hardened soldiers to tears over a simple bite of chocolate or a spoonful of nut paste? It was not mere hunger being satisfied, but an emotional floodgate opening, of longing, of contrast, of the crushing realization that the enemy they had been taught to hate lived in a world of abundance they could scarcely imagine. The contradiction was profound. How could the same nation that unleashed waves of bombers over Europe also provide kindness, comfort, and foods of such richness to those who had once sought its destruction? This question lingers at the heart of the story, one of propaganda shattered by taste, of humanity revealed in the simplest of offerings, and of the strange, unexpected power of chocolate and peanut butter to stir the souls of defeated men. To understand why a bar of chocolate and a spoonful of peanut butter could provoke such profound reactions from German prisoners of war, one must return to the broader canvas of the Second World War itself. By the early 1940s, the conflict had reshaped continents. The Axis powers, led by Adolf Hitler's Germany, had stretched their reach across Europe and North Africa. Entire nations were occupied, economies redirected to fuel the war machine, and populations subjected to strict rationing that steadily drained the color from everyday life. In Germany, by 1943, the once proud and robust economy was faltering under the strain of prolonged war. Civilians back home subsisted on meager rations, watery soups, dark bread stretched with fillers, ersatz coffee brewed from roasted acorns or chicory. Luxuries had all but disappeared. Butter, sugar, and meat became rare and precious. Confectionaries, once symbols of European culture, were almost impossible to obtain. To most Germans, the idea of biting into a thick, creamy bar of milk chocolate was little more than a memory. At the same time, propaganda worked tirelessly to shape perception. Nazi officials portrayed the United States as a decadent, morally weak society, fueled by greed, materialism, and racial impurity. German soldiers were told that capture by Americans would mean starvation, brutality, and humiliation. It was said that the United States, for all its wealth, was spiritually bankrupt and incapable of true discipline. To surrender to such an enemy was framed as a fate worse than death. And yet, when German POWs began arriving on American soil after the campaigns in North Africa and later in Europe, they encountered a reality that stood in stark contrast. The United States, insulated by oceans from direct destruction, maintained a level of material abundance unmatched in war-torn Europe. Its factories not only supplied tanks, planes, and weapons, but also churned out vast quantities of food. Even in wartime, American civilians still enjoyed ration levels that would have seemed luxurious to their European counterparts. Into this abundance came the prisoners, hundreds of thousands transported across the Atlantic. They were settled in camps across the Midwest, the South, and the Great Plains. These camps were often located near farming communities, where captured soldiers could contribute labor to make up for the absence of American men serving overseas. Instead of the brutal existence they expected, they found order, discipline, and, most astonishing of all, decent food. For the Americans, the treatment of POWs was not merely a matter of generosity. It was also strategic. The Geneva Convention of 1929 outlined clear obligations toward prisoners, and the United States largely adhered to those standards. By feeding and housing the POWs properly, America aimed not only to maintain international credibility, but also to encourage reciprocal treatment of Allied soldiers captured in Europe. There was, as well, a belief that humane treatment could weaken the ideological hold of Nazism. If prisoners experienced a stark difference between propaganda and reality, perhaps they would return to Germany with new perspectives. Among the foods that epitomized this cultural chasm were peanut butter and Hershey's chocolate. To Americans, both were everyday staples. Peanut butter, invented in the late 19th century and popularized through the early 20th, had become a fixture of the American diet by the 1940s. Cheap, high in protein, and versatile, it was packed into soldiers' rations and appeared in kitchens across the nation. Hershey's chocolate, meanwhile, was not only a symbol of American industry, but also of morale. The company supplied millions of Hershey's bars to the U.S. military, and a special version, nicknamed the D-ration bar, was included in combat packs for soldiers. For Germans, however, these items were almost alien. Peanuts were not a common crop in Central Europe, and peanut butter was virtually unknown. Chocolate, though familiar in pre-war Europe, had become scarce to the point of non-existence by the war's later years. The idea that such luxuries could be distributed freely, even to prisoners, was unthinkable. This contradiction forms the heart of the narrative, the collision of expectation and reality, propaganda and experience, scarcity and abundance. How could it be that in the midst of a global war, the supposed enemy nation, painted as corrupt and ruthless, was capable of offering prisoners small luxuries their own homeland could not provide even to loyal citizens? The answer lies not only in America's industrial might, but also in the profound cultural differences between the two societies. For Americans, food was more than sustenance. It was a symbol of identity, optimism, and resilience. For German POWs, it became a symbol of humiliation and revelation, a reminder of what their own nation had promised but failed to deliver. The tears shed over peanut butter and chocolate were, in truth, not only about taste. They were about the collapse of illusions. They were about longing for home, for comfort, for sweetness in a world that had grown bitter. They were about the recognition, however fleeting, that the enemy's world was not only richer in material goods, but perhaps freer, kinder, and more human than they had been led to believe. As the story unfolds, we will trace how these prisoners moved from capture to captivity, from expectation to shock, from contradiction to transformation. Their journey reveals not only the power of food, but the fragility of belief, the resilience of humanity, and the enduring truth that even in the darkest of times, small tastes of sweetness can carry profound meaning. The road to captivity was not sudden, but paved with defeat upon defeat, a gradual erosion of confidence that mirrored Germany's waning fortunes in the war. By 1943, the once invincible Wehrmacht had suffered devastating blows. In North Africa, the Afrika Korps under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had been outmaneuvered and ultimately crushed by the combined strength of British and American forces. Entire divisions of German and Italian troops were forced to surrender in Tunisia, their tanks immobilized, their fuel exhausted, their supply lines severed. For many German soldiers, this was their first direct encounter with the Americans. They had been told to expect savagery, but what they experienced was something altogether different. Order, discipline, and logistical mastery on a scale they had never imagined. From the beaches of Sicily to the hedgerows of France, more men would follow the same path into captivity. Crammed into makeshift pens in North Africa or aboard Liberty ships crossing the Atlantic, they were shipped far from the battlefields they once thought they would conquer. The journey itself was disorienting. Stripped of their weapons, stripped of their uniforms, stripped even of the illusion of victory. They were now merely prisoners, no longer soldiers of the Reich, but numbers on a ledger in an American camp. For the men on those transports, the silence was often more deafening than any artillery barrage. Some whispered about what awaited them. Would they be beaten, starved, forced into slave labor? Others clung to grim determination, swearing they would never cooperate with their captors. Propaganda had done its work well. For years, German soldiers had been fed a steady diet of fear. They were told that Anglo-American forces were brutal and merciless, driven by Jewish financiers and greedy industrialists. They were told that capture would mean degradation, perhaps even death in some foreign field. To surrender, they believed, was to forfeit not only honor, but humanity itself. And yet, surrender was unavoidable. By the time Allied offensives cut deep into occupied France in 1944, thousands more Germans laid down their arms. The Normandy campaign alone produced such a flood of prisoners that the Allies were forced to construct temporary cages on the beaches. From there, many were shipped directly to the United States, where space was abundant and labor was needed. For the German soldiers arriving in America, the shock began the moment they stepped onto solid ground. Expecting hostility, they were instead met with efficient processing, medical inspections, and transport to inland camps. The sight of America itself was bewildering. Unlike Europe, scarred by bombing raids and invasion, the American landscape was intact. Railways ran smoothly, farms sprawled with abundance, and towns bustled with an air of confidence and prosperity. Even in wartime, there was no visible sign of deprivation. To the prisoners, it seemed as if they had stepped into another world. The camps themselves varied in size and structure, but many followed a similar pattern. Surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by watchtowers, they resembled military installations more than prisons. Inside, rows of barracks housed the prisoners. Some camps were constructed from wood, others from repurposed buildings, but all provided basic shelter, warmth, and order. Compared to the chaos of the front, where soldiers often slept in trenches or ruined buildings, the camps felt strangely secure. Still, suspicion and fear persisted. The early days of captivity were marked by uncertainty. Rumors spread quickly, feeding on anxieties. Some believed they would soon be transferred to forced labor in mines or factories. Others whispered that their rations would be deliberately withheld to weaken them. When the first meals were served, disbelief was palpable. Instead of the watery soup or black bread they had imagined, they were handed plates of meat, potatoes, vegetables, and bread in quantities that exceeded what many had eaten in months. The taste was unfamiliar, but the fullness it brought could not be denied. Some prisoners hesitated, convinced it was a trick, while others devoured the food hungrily. Slowly, the realization sank in. The Americans were not going to starve them. This discovery alone was enough to sow confusion. What kind of enemy treated captives with such generosity? Was this weakness? Was it arrogance? Or was it something deeper? An adherence to a code of conduct that transcended the hatred of war. In those first weeks, the POWs clung tightly to their beliefs. Many insisted that the comforts of captivity were temporary, that the Americans were softening them up for something more sinister. Others consoled themselves with the idea that Germany would ultimately triumph. and that their time in captivity would be short. They imagined liberation, or perhaps even exchange, returning home as heroes who had endured the trials of an enemy camp. Letters home revealed these conflicting emotions. In carefully censored lines, some prisoners described their astonishment at the decent treatment. Others downplayed their comfort, unwilling to admit to families enduring hardship in Germany that they were better fed in captivity than their loved ones were at home. Guilt sometimes gnawed at them as they thought of mothers and children queuing for ration cards while they sat to meals, of meat and bread under the watchful eyes of their captors. The psychological burden of captivity was heavy. For men raised in the militarized culture of Nazi Germany, surrender was an unthinkable disgrace. Propaganda had instilled the belief that only cowards or traitors laid down their arms. To be captured alive was to bear a permanent mark of shame. And yet, here they were, tens of thousands of them, living daily lives behind fences in a land they had once been told was decadent and corrupt. As the days turned to weeks, they began to settle into routine. Roll calls, work assignments, and camp duties structured their lives. They found themselves working on farms, harvesting crops, repairing roads, or cutting timber. For the Americans, the labor was invaluable, filling gaps left by men serving overseas. For the prisoners, it was a way to pass time, earn small privileges, and cling to a sense of purpose. Still, the weight of expectation hung over them. They had been told to prepare for cruelty, and they carried that expectation like a shield. Every kind gesture, every decent meal, every provision of clothing or medical care was met with suspicion. Surely, they thought, it was a facade that would eventually give way to the brutality they had been promised. They braced themselves for the moment when the mask of civility would fall away. It was in this state of guarded expectation that the first shocks of reality began to appear. Food would play a central role in those shocks. Meals that included items unfamiliar and exotic to German palates. Canned fruit, white bread, peanut butter, and the fabled Hershey's chocolate challenged not only their taste buds, but also their world views. For men who had expected hunger, the abundance of food became the first undeniable contradiction. Yet before the sweetness of chocolate could dissolve on their tongues, before the sticky richness of peanut butter could cling to their mouths, they carried with them a lifetime of propaganda and prejudice. These men, captured far from home and thrust into a world they could scarcely comprehend, stood at the threshold of transformation. The expectations of cruelty and deprivation were about to collide with the shocks of abundance and kindness, and so the stage was set for the tears that would one day fall, not from pain, but from taste, from contrast, and from the sudden collapse of illusions. The first days of captivity often pass in a blur for soldiers, as the adrenaline of battle fades and the monotony of confinement sets in. For the German prisoners brought across the Atlantic, those early days in the camps were punctuated by moments of profound surprise, moments that disrupted every expectation they had carried with them. The propaganda of cruelty and starvation dissolved not through lectures or speeches, but through small, tangible experiences: a clean bed, a hot meal, and the unfamiliar comfort of abundance. One of the earliest shocks was the food itself. In Germany, rations had dwindled to the point where butter, sugar, and meat were scarce luxuries, often reserved for the military elite or the black market. Civilians at home scraped by with turnips, ersatz coffee, and whatever scraps the ration book could secure. Soldiers in the field fared no better. Many German POWs had endured weeks of hunger before surrender, subsisting on hard bread, canned horse meat, or thin soups stretched with whatever roots or grains could be scrounged. In the United States, the contrast was staggering. Meals in POW camps were prepared according to the standards set by the Geneva Convention, but in practice, they often exceeded those requirements. On their trays appeared foods that seemed almost decadent: roasted meats, mashed potatoes, vegetables, fresh bread, and even desserts. For men who had braced themselves for starvation, the first bite was nothing short of bewildering. Some prisoners whispered that it must be a trick, that poison might be concealed in the sweetness of the pie or the richness of the butter. But as the days passed, suspicion gave way to reluctant acceptance. And then came the peculiarities of American cuisine, foods that to German palates seemed exotic, almost alien. Peanut butter was among the most shocking. Its sticky, salty sweet richness was unlike anything they had ever encountered. At first, many rejected it outright, struggling to understand why Americans would grind nuts into a paste. Yet curiosity soon overcame hesitation. One spoonful was enough to provoke laughter, confusion, or in some cases, tears. For men who had grown accustomed to the dull monotony of wartime rations, peanut butter was both baffling and irresistible. Alongside peanut butter came the revelation of Hershey's chocolate. The foil-wrapped bars, simple in appearance, carried with them the taste of a world untouched by deprivation. Rich, creamy, and undeniably sweet, the chocolate melted on the tongue in a way that seemed to dissolve not just hunger, but despair. Some prisoners, hardened by years of war, found themselves overcome with emotion. The tears that welled in their eyes were not only for the taste itself, but for what it represented: abundance, kindness, and a reminder of a life they once knew but had lost to war. Personal accounts confirm these reactions. In letters home, carefully censored by American authorities, POWs described their astonishment at the quality of the food. Some wrote of their disbelief at being served chocolate or fruit, items that their families in Germany had not seen in years. Others confessed, with guilt, that they were eating better in captivity than their wives and children were at home. This realization gnawed at them, deepening the emotional impact of each meal. How could they, as prisoners, dine more comfortably than their loved ones under the bombs and ration cards of Germany? The shocks extended beyond food. Hygiene was another revelation. Many POWs had become accustomed to filth during the war. Muddy trenches, lice-infested uniforms, and weeks without bathing. In American camps, they were given access to showers, soap, and clean clothing. The sensation of hot water cascading over skin that had known only cold rags and muddy basins was transformative. For some, it was the first time in years they felt truly clean. The psychological effect of this simple act of hygiene cannot be overstated. It restored a measure of dignity that captivity had threatened to erase. Medical care provided another startling contrast. American doctors examined prisoners, treating wounds and illnesses with care and efficiency. German propaganda had warned that captives would be left to rot. Yet here they were, receiving medicine and surgeries they might not have had access to even in their homeland during the war's final years. In one camp, a prisoner with a festering wound later admitted in his diary that he had expected to be left untreated as punishment for being the enemy. Instead, he was bandaged, medicated, and nursed back to health. The kindness of this act unsettled him more than cruelty would have. Entertainment, too, was unexpected. Within weeks of arrival, prisoners found themselves with access to books, musical instruments, and even opportunities to stage plays or concerts. Camps organized athletic competitions, giving the men an outlet for energy and camaraderie. The sound of laughter and music drifting across barbed wire fences was an incongruous reminder that even in captivity, life continued. Some POWs took up painting or carving, their creations later sent home as gifts or mementos. For men who had braced for brutality, the ability to express themselves creatively was nothing short of astonishing. These comforts stirred powerful emotions, but they also sowed confusion. The dissonance between expectation and reality gnawed at the prisoners' minds. If America was truly the barbaric, greedy, and corrupt nation their leaders had described, how could it afford such generosity? If their captors were monsters, why did they provide food, medicine, and even chocolate? The contradictions were not just external. They burrowed into the hearts of the men, creating inner conflicts that would intensify as captivity stretched on. Yet, despite the abundance, guilt lingered. News from home arrived slowly, filtered through censors, but enough letters spoke of hardship to remind the prisoners that their families were suffering. Mothers rationed potatoes, wives traded on the black market, children grew thin from lack of milk. Each sweet taste of chocolate, each spoonful of peanut butter, carried with it a pang of sorrow. Some POWs admitted privately that they could not enjoy the food without thinking of their hungry children. Others concealed their good fortune in letters, ashamed to confess that they were treated better in captivity than their families in freedom. The first shocks and reactions were thus a mixture of joy, confusion, guilt, and disbelief. Tears shed over chocolate were as much for the sweetness of the moment as for the bitterness of the contrast. Some men began to soften toward their captors, while others hardened further, refusing to be swayed by what they dismissed as manipulative kindness. The camps became a crucible where ideology and reality clashed daily, each taste and each act of care a challenge to the narratives of the Reich. As weeks turned into months, the initial astonishment gave way to deeper realizations. If the Americans could be generous, what else might prove false in the propaganda they had been taught? If their captors could offer comfort, what did that say about the justice of the cause for which they had fought? These questions lingered unanswered as the prisoners adjusted to life behind the wire. But the contradictions did not end here. The surprises would only grow sharper, the emotional tensions more complex. As the months unfolded, the prisoners discovered not only food and hygiene, but entertainment, labor, and even friendships that defied every expectation. The first shocks had cracked the facade of propaganda, but the real collapse was yet to come. The first shocks of captivity, the food, the hygiene, the medical care, were powerful enough to unsettle German prisoners. Yet those were only the beginning. As the weeks stretched into months, contradictions multiplied, each one striking deeper at the ideological armor they had carried into war. What began as astonishment over meals gradually evolved into an unsettling realization. The world their leaders had described was not the world they inhabited now. Work assignments were among the earliest and most striking contradictions. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could be required to perform non-military labor, and in America, this meant tasks that ranged from farm work to road maintenance. The irony was unmistakable. Men who had once fought to subjugate foreign populations now found themselves picking cotton in Texas, harvesting wheat in Kansas, or repairing roads in Alabama. Farmers welcomed them, often treating them with a civility that seemed incompatible with the image of Americans as merciless brutes. At first, the Germans bristled, considering such labor humiliating. Yet many soon discovered a strange satisfaction in the work. The rhythm of farm life, the dignity of productive labor, and even the kindness of American farmers who offered them water or shade challenged every expectation they had harbored. Letters home often reflected this growing sense of contradiction. Some prisoners described the fertile fields and plentiful harvests of America, contrasting them with the bomb-scarred cities of Germany, where hunger gnawed at civilians daily. Others mentioned the baffling civility of American guards and civilians. "They treat us like men," one prisoner wrote, though the letter was carefully censored. That simple phrase carried a weight far heavier than it appeared. Entertainment within the camps deepened the contradictions. Prisoners organized orchestras, choirs, and theatrical performances. Some camps even arranged libraries, stocked with books in German and English. Classes were offered in languages, mathematics, and even vocational skills. To men who expected degradation, these opportunities felt surreal. Some embraced them eagerly, seeing education as a way to prepare for a future beyond the war. Others rejected them outright, muttering that such luxuries were merely another trick to erode their loyalty. Yet whether embraced or resisted, the very existence of these activities undermined the picture of America as a cruel, cultureless enemy. Even more disorienting were the personal interactions with guards and civilians. American guards, many scarcely older than the prisoners themselves, often displayed a relaxed discipline that contrasted with the iron rigidity of German military culture. They joked, they shared cigarettes, they treated prisoners not as mortal enemies, but as men. At times, American civilians working near camps encountered the POWs and expressed curiosity rather than hostility. Children sometimes waved at prisoners, in passing, an act that seemed incomprehensible to men who had expected to be hated. The contradictions intensified when German prisoners realized that America itself was not under siege. They had believed the propaganda that Allied nations were starving, collapsing under the strain of war. Yet here they were, surrounded by abundance. Farms produced mountains of food, factories roared with industry, and civilians went about their lives with a confidence utterly absent in Germany. For men who had fought under the belief that the Reich represented strength and prosperity, the contrast was humiliating. How could the supposed enemy live in such security and plenty while their own homeland burned? Among the most profound emotional turning points came when prisoners received letters from home. Even heavily censored, the letters revealed the stark truth. Families endured cold winters without coal. Children went hungry. Cities lay in rubble. Some prisoners were haunted by the knowledge that they ate better in captivity than their loved ones did in freedom. A Hershey's bar or a jar of peanut butter, once laughed at for its strangeness, now carried with it the sting of guilt. Every sweet bite became a reminder of the scarcity at home, every meal a contrast to the hunger of wives and children. Some prisoners hardened their hearts, clinging to ideology as a defense against shame. They told themselves that the Americans were soft, that their abundance was temporary, that Germany's true strength lay in its spirit, not in material goods. Others could not escape the gnawing doubts. If the Reich was so mighty, why could it not provide for its people? If America was so decadent, why did its farms overflow and its factories thrive? Moments of moral dilemma sharpened these questions. In some camps, prisoners were given the opportunity to purchase small luxuries with wages earned from labor: soap, cigarettes, candy. For the first time, men who had been reduced to numbers on a prisoner's ledger now had choices. Some sent these items home in packages, desperate to provide for families across the ocean. Others kept them, unable to part with the small comforts that had come to symbolize survival. The act of choosing itself revealed the growing complexity of their captivity. They were enemies, yet they lived in a world of options and comforts unimaginable in their homeland. Entertainment and labor were not the only arenas where contradictions grew. Religion played a role as well. Chaplains occasionally visited camps, offering services for prisoners. For men raised in a Germany where faith was often entangled with ideology, the simple act of worship in captivity became a profound reminder of humanity that transcended national borders. The sight of Americans treating their spiritual needs with respect, rather than contempt, unsettled the narratives they had been fed. The ideological cracks widened further when some prisoners were exposed to news. American authorities permitted access to certain newspapers, though often censored. Still, prisoners learned of Allied victories, of German defeats, and of the devastation wrought upon their homeland. Each article contradicted the optimistic reports they had once read in German-controlled media. The Reich, they realized, was faltering, and the Americans who fed them chocolate were also dismantling the war machine they had served. Among the most significant turning points were the emotional releases. The tears shed not only over food, but over the slow collapse of illusions. A hardened soldier who had marched across Europe could be reduced to weeping by the taste of chocolate. Not because of the flavor alone, but because of what it represented. Another, sitting on a farm wagon after a day's work, confessed to fellow prisoners that he no longer believed in the Reich's promises. These moments, shared quietly among men, revealed the deep transformations underway. Yet not all prisoners embraced these contradictions. Some clung stubbornly to Nazi ideology, forming internal hierarchies within the camps to enforce loyalty. They threatened or punished fellow prisoners who expressed admiration for America. For these men, the kindness of their captors was dismissed as propaganda in another form. They insisted that abundance was temporary, that Germany would rise again, that only traitors could be swayed by chocolate and peanut butter. Their resistance highlighted the stakes of the contradictions. For some, the dissonance led to softening and change, while for others, it provoked fiercer loyalty born of fear. As captivity wore on, however, the weight of experience grew undeniable. The abundance, the kindness, the civility, it all stood in stark opposition to the world they had been told to expect. Each contradiction layered upon the last, creating an unbearable tension that demanded resolution. Could these men cling forever to the ideology of the Reich? Or would the realities of captivity reshape them? The stage was set for a climax that would shatter any remaining illusions. The contradictions had escalated, pressing prisoners to a breaking point. Soon, one event, an act so simple yet so profound, would crystallize the transformation. It would come not from words, nor from lectures, but from taste itself. The sweetness of chocolate, the richness of peanut butter, and the tears of men who realized that their world would never be the same again. The slow accumulation of contradictions, good food, humane treatment, meaningful work, and unexpected freedoms, brought the prisoners to the edge of transformation. Yet it was often the smallest moments that tipped the balance. Among all the symbols of American abundance, two stood out: peanut butter and Hershey's chocolate. What to an American was ordinary became, to the German POWs, extraordinary. So extraordinary that it forced tears from hardened men. The climax of this story took place not in a battlefield or a council chamber, but in the mess halls of America's prisoner of war camps. Trays of food were set down before men who had learned to expect nothing more than gruel. On some days, alongside bread and meat, appeared small bars of chocolate wrapped in foil, or jars of peanut butter placed for communal use. At first, suspicion reigned. Could it be true that America would waste such luxuries on prisoners? Slowly, hesitantly, men unwrapped the bars, dipped spoons into the jars. The first taste brought astonishment. For some, it was Hershey's chocolate, the creamy sweetness bursting on tongues starved of sugar for years. For others, it was the sticky, salty richness of peanut butter, clinging to the roof of the mouth in a way utterly alien to German cuisine. The reaction was immediate and profound. Silence often fell, followed by nervous laughter, and then by tears. Grown men, soldiers who had endured the thunder of artillery, the fear of capture, the shame of defeat, wept openly in the presence of their comrades. Why did they cry? It was not the food alone, but what it represented. Each bite was a reminder of everything they had lost: the normalcy of family dinners, the joy of childhood sweets, the innocence of a world before war. Chocolate and peanut butter were more than flavors. They were symbols of abundance, of care, of a society unscarred by the destruction that had consumed Europe. To taste them was to confront the lie of propaganda directly, to realize that the enemy was not the monster they had been taught to hate, but a people capable of kindness and generosity, even toward their captives. For some prisoners, the emotional weight was unbearable. Diaries and letters recall men breaking down, confessing that they felt more human in captivity than they had in years of service. One recalled the moment of tasting chocolate as the instant he realized Germany's defeat was not only military, but moral. Another wrote that peanut butter tasted like a dream he had never known, a dream that both comforted and tormented him, for it revealed a richness of life denied to his family back home. This climax of taste and tears marked a profound transformation. Men who had clung stubbornly to ideology began to soften. Doubt crept into conversations once dominated by rigid loyalty. Around campfires and in barracks bunks, prisoners whispered about what they had experienced. Could it be that America, for all its flaws, was stronger because it allowed its people to live in abundance? Could it be that the Reich's promises of glory were hollow compared to the simple pleasure of a chocolate bar? For some, this realization planted seeds of admiration. They began to see America not only as a formidable enemy, but as a model of prosperity. A few even dreamed of one day returning, not as prisoners, but as immigrants. For others, the transformation was quieter, more personal. They shed tears not for politics, but for memory. Memories of their children who had never tasted chocolate, of wives who rationed every scrap of sugar, of a homeland where abundance had become a distant dream. The climax was not without conflict. Hardline prisoners tried to stifle these emotions, branding those who embraced American kindness as weak or traitorous. In some camps, Nazi loyalists enforced strict discipline, threatening anyone who expressed admiration for America. But even their threats could not erase what had been tasted, what had been felt. A bar of chocolate could not be untasted. Peanut butter could not be forgotten. The sweetness lingered, carrying with it the bitter truth that propaganda had crumbled under the simplest of experiences. The transformation extended beyond food. Once the emotional floodgates opened, prisoners began to notice other contradictions with fresh eyes. They saw guards who treated them with casual humanity, civilians who showed curiosity rather than hatred, a country that thrived while their own withered. Each of these observations added weight to the realization born of chocolate and peanut butter, that their enemy's strength lay not in cruelty, but in abundance, not in oppression, but in a freedom that produced prosperity. The climax of tears became a turning point for many POWs. In that moment of vulnerability, they moved from suspicion to recognition, from hostility to reluctant respect. They had entered captivity expecting humiliation. Instead, they discovered humanity. The transformation was not uniform, nor was it immediate, but it was real. For thousands of men, captivity in America became not merely a period of survival, but an education in contrasts, a revelation that reshaped their understanding of the world. By the time liberation approached in 1945, many prisoners had been irrevocably changed. Some wrote in later years that the taste of chocolate in captivity remained etched in memory, as vivid as the sounds of battle. Others recalled peanut butter with equal clarity, describing it as a symbol of the new world they had glimpsed. These memories became, for many, the moment when the war ended not just in military defeat, but in personal transformation. The climax of peanut butter and Hershey's chocolate was not about sweetness alone. It was about the collapse of illusions, the awakening of empathy, and the recognition of shared humanity. It was about the power of small, ordinary things to reveal extraordinary truths. For men who had known only scarcity and propaganda, the simplest of foods became the catalyst for the greatest of realizations, that their enemy was not only stronger, but perhaps more human than they had ever imagined. The war drew to its inevitable conclusion in the spring of 1945. Germany lay in ruins, its cities reduced to rubble by relentless Allied bombing, its armies shattered on both eastern and western fronts. For the German prisoners housed in America's camps, news of surrender arrived with a mixture of relief, grief, and uncertainty. They were thousands of miles from home, enclosed by barbed wire. Yet their minds wandered to families in devastated towns, to wives and children enduring hunger, to a homeland unrecognizable in its destruction. When the gates of the camps finally opened, many POWs faced a new kind of anguish. For years, captivity had meant safety, food, and even small comforts that their families lacked. The prospect of return carried both joy and dread. They longed to see their loved ones, yet feared the conditions awaiting them. Some admitted openly that they dreaded leaving the stability of American camps for the chaos of post-war Germany. It was an irony too sharp to ignore. Men who had once wept over peanut butter and chocolate now wept again, this time at the thought of losing the abundance and dignity they had found in captivity. Repatriation began in waves. Trains carried prisoners to ports, and ships ferried them back across the Atlantic. For many, the return was sobering. The Germany they re-entered was not the one they had left. Cities such as Hamburg, Dresden, and Berlin were scarred landscapes of rubble. Factories stood silent, homes reduced to shells, streets filled with the displaced and the hungry. Families greeted returning soldiers with both relief and tears, but also with stories of deprivation, bombings, and endless queues for food that never came. It was in this contrast that the memory of America's camps and of chocolate and peanut butter gained its lasting power. Men compared the abundance they had tasted as prisoners with the starvation faced by their families in freedom. Some could not bring themselves to describe the comforts they had enjoyed. It felt like betrayal. Others spoke openly, telling of plentiful meals, clean barracks, and strange American foods. In these stories, the simple act of tasting chocolate or peanut butter became shorthand for the vast gulf between the lives of ordinary Germans and those of ordinary Americans during the war. For many prisoners, the experience planted seeds that would grow long after the war. In interviews years later, former POWs recalled that their time in American camps had reshaped their view of the world. They spoke not only of chocolate, but of fairness, of kindness, of the realization that propaganda had deceived them. Some returned to Germany determined to rebuild their country in a new image, one that valued democracy and prosperity over conquest and ideology. Others carried the memory more privately, telling their children and grandchildren of the day they first tasted peanut butter or Hershey's chocolate and realized the world was larger, richer, and kinder than they had believed. The United States, for its part, understood the quiet power of such experiences. The humane treatment of prisoners was not only a matter of law or morality, it was also a tool of influence. By showing captured soldiers a different kind of world, America hoped to weaken the hold of Nazism and plant the seeds of post-war reconciliation. In many ways, the tears shed over chocolate and peanut butter proved the effectiveness of that strategy. No propaganda could fully erase the memory of kindness experienced in captivity. Yet the story also carries a more universal lesson. War is often remembered for its battles, its destruction, and its cruelty. But within that darkness, small moments of humanity shine all the brighter. A bar of chocolate, a spoonful of peanut butter. These are not weapons, nor strategies, nor treaties. They are ordinary things, yet in the right moment, they can carry extraordinary meaning. For German prisoners, they symbolized the collapse of illusions, the recognition of shared humanity, and the possibility of a different future. The memory of those tears endured. Long after the war, former POWs recounted the story to families, historians, and journalists. Their voices, once raised in battle, now trembled with emotion as they spoke of sweetness that reminded them of childhood, of abundance that contrasted with hunger, of kindness that stood in stark opposition to cruelty. These testimonies remind us that history is not only shaped by grand events, but also by intimate moments where the human spirit reveals itself. As the decades passed, the world changed. Germany rose from the ashes rebuilt itself, and became a cornerstone of a new Europe. The United States emerged as a superpower, its culture and products spreading across the globe. Peanut butter and Hershey's chocolate, once exotic to German prisoners, eventually became familiar even in post-war Europe. But for those who first tasted them behind barbed wire, they never became ordinary. They remained symbols of transformation, memories too vivid to fade. And so we return to the image with which this story began. A group of weary men in uniform, sitting behind fences under an American sky, their faces streaked with tears not of pain but of emotion, tears for what they had lost, tears for what they had discovered, tears for the collapse of propaganda and the awakening of truth. In that moment, the war was not only about armies and nations, but about individuals discovering, through taste, the possibility of a different world. The story of German POWs crying after tasting peanut butter and Hershey's chocolate is more than an anecdote of captivity. It is a reminder of the profound impact of small gestures. It is a story about the power of food to cross boundaries, about the way kindness can erode hatred, about the fragility of belief in the face of lived reality. It is a story that invites us to reflect on our own world, where propaganda still seeks to divide, where scarcity and abundance remain unevenly distributed, and where the smallest acts of humanity can carry the greatest weight. In the end, what endures is not the bitterness of war, but the sweetness of memory. The prisoners who wept over chocolate and peanut butter remind us that even in the darkest of times, the simplest of things can reveal the deepest truths. Perhaps that is the final lesson of their story, that humanity is often found not in the grand gestures of leaders or the strategies of generals, but in the small, unexpected moments when kindness and abundance shatter the walls built by fear. And so the taste lingers, not just of chocolate and peanut butter, but of transformation itself. A taste that carried across decades, across generations, reminding all who hear it that even the hardest hearts can be softened, even the most stubborn illusions can be broken, and even in war, the simplest of flavors can bring the most profound of revelations.